Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about chainsaw sharpening, some do's and don'ts, and some other do's and don'ts that people don't do and should do. So first of all, we'll talk about probably something that you hear a lot about is the gullet. Now, the gullet really doesn't do anything. This is a gullet down here, or if we look at a better tooth for an example, full chisel. So this is where our gullet is, and where you see the fold that comes down to the horizontal part, well, all you need to do is keep this reasonably flat. If you're using the right file and you're holding the file in the right position, which is between 20 and 25% above the top of the tooth, then the gullet will be flat. The chips will evacuate and flow through there better from the tooth in front of it. The chips all go past. So look, the gullet is something that you really don't need to really worry about. You may sort of hear some videos and people are talking about the gullet as if it's something special. It's just the bottom of the tooth. That's all it is. And normally if you're filing properly or you're grinding properly, it's never going to be an issue. So that's something that I wouldn't sort of worry about. The next thing's a bit of a do or a don't, and that is when people are using a file in a tooth or a grinder, that they're using it incorrectly. And an example is if this is a grinding wheel, that it should be sitting somewhere like that. So you've got to be careful that you've got the right grinding wheel and the right radius. If you have the wrong radius on there, it won't fit in here properly and it won't have the right shape. The other thing is files. People use the wrong files. An example is that a 4mm file is 532, a 4.8mm file is 3/16, a 13/64 is 5.2, a 1/4" pico is 1/8, which is 3.2, and a 5.5mm is a 732. So they're your different files. And please make sure that you're using the right file for the right tooth. Now, the other thing is when we talk about the grinding wheel, there are only two types of grinding wheels, which is a 3.2mm, which is 1/8, and a 4.7mm. And we'll get into that subject a little bit later because of the grinding wheels don't match the file size. And that can cause a little bit of a problem, especially if you're out in the field. And if you've ground something on a grinder and it doesn't match the radius of the file, and you're going to hand file the chain out in the field, then you're going to have to file excess metal until the file creates its own radius. So therefore, it is extremely important that you, when you dress the grinding wheel with the stone, that you try and create the same radius as the file. So it can take a little bit of experience to do that. So yeah, that's something to consider, and that's the reason why I always take spare chains with me. So it doesn't matter whether they were ground with a file or whether they were sharpened on a chainsaw grinder. If I take a spare chain and I swap it over, an example would be this. If I was going to go out all day chainsawing, I'd have about half a dozen chains. I always keep that many, right? And that would be my main saw. So that would be a half a dozen 3/8 chains. And that way I'll never run out. I'll never have a problem. I don't have to dick around sharpening chains. It takes 1 or 2 minutes to swap them over. I've got a brand new chain that's razor sharp. Hand filing in the field, yeah, it used to be done many, many years ago. But, chains aren't that expensive, especially if you bulk buy them. And it's good to take a few with you. So yeah, that's that good advice. Some do's and don'ts. Do carry extra ones with you, because if you don't, then you're going to have to hand file out in the field, which is going to take time. Now, for those that are not 100% familiar with full chisel and semi-chisel, got a little bit of a profile here. Looking at the front of the tooth, it looks a little bit like that. That's semi-chisel. Sorry, full chisel. You'll notice that the right-hand side has a fairly square corner, whereas a semi-chisel has that rounded corner. And we can see that on this replica as well, where it comes to a nice sharp point. So this is our working corner, the point of the tooth. And the moment that that goes blunt, you're going to have to sharpen it. And if we look at the semi-chisel, you'll notice it's got a beautiful rounded corner. So there's more surface area on that point, and that means that it's more durable, it will last longer. So do use semi-chisel virtually in any type of wood that you want. 90% of chains out there that are sold are semi-chisel. Okay, don't use full chisel like this in really old hardwood. You can, but it will go blunt much, much quicker. Still better off with a semi-chisel. So do use full chisel like this in green wood. This is where it's much more suitable. Okay? Okay. The next thing that we can talk about is the angles. Now, the best angle that I like to use for the top plate is 30 degrees, that angle that you can see there. That's probably the most common used angle, especially with Stihl and other manufacturers. They like to use 30 degrees. So that's our top plate angle. The next angle is the top plate cutting angle. That's the angle on the beveled face here. So if we zoom in there, hopefully you can see this beveled face. So you've got two angles. This is a compound beveled angle here, because on the top plate, you've got your 30 degrees and you've got your cutting angle here, which is what we refer to as a top plate cutting angle. And the grinding wheel or the file will leave an angle of approximately 55 to 60 degrees, depends whether you hold the file at 20% above the tooth or 25% above the tooth, which is what is recommended by Stihl. So, the do's and don'ts here. Do use 30 degrees on your top plate angle. Don't use crazy angles like 35 degrees because it's going to go blunt quicker. I like to use 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle rather than 60. It's more aggressive and it seems to be very durable, especially in semi-chisel. So there's a few do's and don'ts in angles there, but generally speaking, 60 and 50 degrees is for your top plate cutting angle, and 25 degrees and 30 degrees is for your top plate. So your top plate cutting angle definitely will perform better at 50 degrees, and your top plate will definitely perform better at 30 degrees. But as I said, if you've got really hard wood, you can back them off a little bit, another 5 degrees. You can back that off, and the top plate cutting angle, you could back that off to 60. So where you've got some nice green wood or a little bit of softwood, certainly you can run 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle and 30 degrees on the top plate. And this is recommended by Stihl. Stihl recommend 50 degrees. I've never seen Stihl recommend any other angle. The last time that they recommended something different than 60-30 was over 30 years ago. So typically all Stihl chains, except for the Rapid Duro and the Hexa, are 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle and 30 degrees on the top plate. Now the next couple of do's and don'ts refer to the chainsaw grinder. And it's recommended that you use a grind wheel, so don't use the incorrect wheel. And do make sure that you dress the wheel, that you've got the correct radius for the file. These grinders, except for a Stihl USG grinder, only come in two sizes, which is 3.2 millimeters and 4.7. So, where possible, if possible, dress the wheel that's suitable to the radius of the file. So, and as I said, we've spoken before, you've got 3.2 millimeter file, 4 millimeter file, 4.8 millimeter file, 5.2 millimeter file, and a 5.5 millimeter file. So you've only got two wheels there, so you need to dress the radius correctly so that it can put a nice shape on the tooth. The other thing is, we spoke briefly before about the 50 degrees on the top plate cutting angle and the 30 degrees on the top plate. The only thing that we haven't spoken about is do or don't on the 10 degrees downward tilt. 10 degrees downward tilt is not going to harm any full chisel chain. If anything, you'll get a slightly better profile on the side of the plate. A lot of manufacturers, except Still, don't recommend it. Oregon certainly do on many of the chains, so do Carlton, and many other manufacturers recommend it, whether you're using a file or whether you're using a chainsaw grinder. So the do's and the don'ts there is follow your chainsaw chain manufacturer with the recommendations of the angles. If you're not sure of the angles, go for 50 degrees on here, 30 degrees on there, full chisel, give it 10 degrees downward tilt. This is a tiltable vise, so it's just a matter of loosening the nut and the vise will tilt that way for a right hand cutter and pull it towards you for a left hand cutter. So pretty simple and straightforward there. The don't is don't grind too deeply into the gullet. That's a bad thing to do. Also, if your wheel is not sharpened correct, if your wheel is not ground correctly, it's not going to sharpen as good as what it should. So you can improve your sharpening skills by making sure that you've got the correct angles on here and you've dressed the wheel the correct radius to match the file. One of the reasons that I say that is that, and I mentioned it before, if you're grinding on here and you haven't dressed the wheel properly and then you're out in the field, so you've used a chainsaw grinder and then you're out in the field and you're going to run a file through it and the radius on this is different than the file, you're going to have to grind excess metal. So it's a great idea that if you take extra chains with you, you won't run into that problem. So yeah, that's another do and don't. If you're using a chainsaw grinder, take extra chains with you. Don't file chains that were done with a chainsaw grinder because you're going to have to file extra metal away unless you accurately profile this grinding wheel that's so close to a file shape. But that's almost impossible to do. You'll come close. So typically, if you're going to go out in the field and you like to use the file, just be aware that if it was ground on a grinder, you're going to have to do a few extra strokes because you're going to change that profile slightly unless you've dressed this almost identical. But as I said, that's almost impossible to do that. Now, when we talk about the two wheel sizes, you'll find out if you're using 3/8 low profile Pico, or you'll find out that you've got a 3.2 millimeter wheel, you only need to slightly dress the wheel so it's got a 2 mil radius on there, which will be close enough to a 4 millimeter file. If you've got 0.325 chain, which is you're using a 4.8 millimeter file, this is a 4.7 millimeter wheel. So it's pretty much almost a perfect match. It's only if you've got 3/8 standard chain and 404, you need to dress this accordingly. So we've got some more do's and don'ts on chainsaw grinding. And that's mainly in the setting up of a chain that you want to sharpen. So what you got to make sure that you do is when you put the chain in its guide and you make the adjustment, first of all, make sure that you do set up the top plate cutting angle and you set up the top plate. This is a semi-chisel, so we don't need to give any tilt. So the next thing that you have to do is make sure that you don't adjust the backstop so that it's touching the grinding wheel too much. And that's pretty easy. That all as you do is adjust this, pushes the tooth forward, bring the grinding wheel down so that it just touches. It's not touching now, so I can spin the wheel. So what you need to do is just adjust this so it goes forwards a little bit. Now you can hear that it's touching, the grinding wheel's just touching the tooth. This is what I refer to as the starting point. Don't adjust this so that it's touching too much. You're going to grind off too much metal. You want to grind off the minimum amount of metal. So that's what you do. You set this up so that it pushes the tooth forwards so that it just touches. What you don't do is that when you've ground all this side and you've got to grind the other side, don't start grinding straight away. What you need to do is to set up the other side with the backstop so that it's just touching the wheel. By doing it that way, it ensures that you're grinding the same amount of metal off the left tooth as well as the right tooth. A lot of people make the mistake that they set it up on one side and they just automatically switch to the other side and they don't calibrate, if you will. They don't set it up properly for the other side. They just switch it to the other side and start grinding straight away. So make sure that you do at least calibrate it. Make sure that you put the chain in, you've adjusted this, you spend a bit of time to set it up on the left side, you spend exactly the same amount of time to set it up on the right side so that it grinds evenly. This is another mistake people make. The other mistake that you don't want to do, and people do it all the time, they grind far, far too deeply into the gullet. And if you've spent the time to put a radius on the wheel, you don't need to put the grinding wheel down the bottom. You're not grinding the bottom of the gullet. You really don't want the grinding wheel. If we look at the tooth again, there's the fold. So the fold starts about here and goes down to the gullet. You don't want to be going anywhere near the bottom of this, right? So even if it's a 0.5 millimeter above where my fingernail is, where that fold comes, that's good enough position to be in. So I hope that information helps. As I said, the best angles that you could use on a grinder, to me, are 50 degrees on here, the tiltable head, and on the vise for the top plate, we're looking at 30 degrees, and on a full chisel, it's up to you whether you use 10 degrees downward tilt. Depends whether that's recommended by your manufacturer. So there's some of the do's and don'ts on the grinders. It's easy to make mistakes. Yeah, very easy to make mistakes. And the other thing is it can be very easy to sort of fall into bad habits and not grind. Now, the other thing that you don't want to do is that when you're pulling this grinding wheel down, and we'll just demonstrate that you don't want to just bring it down and hold it like that. Don't do it that way. The way to do it, that you bring it down and you slightly touch. So we'll just demonstrate that. Now, I've adjusted the depth so that I'm not going to grind into the gullet. Now, as you can see, when we did adjust this, it just touched the grinding wheel So this is really grinding off enough metal. And we may be able to zoom in there and even see that. We'll just turn it off. I always figure out that you only need to grind about 0.1 to 0.2 of a millimetre off. It possibly could have a little bit more. I can see a little bit of a black spot on there. So that's pretty straightforward to do. That's just a matter of putting him back in, adjusting my backstop a little bit more. And that's all that's needed to be done. That will grind. That looks a lot better. Look at that, nice and shiny. That's fine. Feels sharp as well. So that's some of the do's and don'ts. Now, what you do from this point is that you grind all the teeth there. Now, one other thing that I would do, especially on a used chain, don't start on your smallest tooth, right? So just look at the chain very quickly for about 10 or 15 seconds. Just examine it. If you're doing a right hand tooth, try and find a tooth that's roughly about the average length. Start with that one. Don't start with your shortest tooth, because if you start with your shortest tooth, you'll grind too much material off. And that's why I said that what you need to do when you set up on the other side, you need to do exactly the same thing. Examine the tooth and start with the tooth that looks about the average length. The mistake people make is that they don't do that. They just throw the chain on, start grinding, and wondering why this side is longer than that side, or that side's longer than this side. So there's some of the do's and don'ts on chainsaw grinding in setting up your backstop correctly to make sure that you are grinding the same amount of metal off the left tooth and the right tooth. Okay, another do and don't. This was the chain that I just sharpened. And you may remember before I was saying that if you grind on a grinder and you take the chain out into the field, you're going to have to do extra file strokes to get the profile the same. Now, the grinding wheel that I had on there was profiled for Stills RS. So it doesn't have the same C shape as a file. As you can see, that as I push the file in there, you can see that it looks different, all right? It doesn't look the same. I've got to start now to grind excess metal off that. So what I actually did with this tooth was I put a bit of red texture on it. We'll just turn it around. And we're going to, there's the red texture there, you can see it. So what we're going to do is file, see how many strokes before that file makes a new profile. Okay, so what we're going to do, you can see the red texture. I'll run the file through a stroke at a time, and we'll see how many strokes it takes until it gets rid of that red texture. So I'll hold it at 30 degrees. As you can see, the file removed a little bit up the top, a little bit down the bottom. That's one stroke. That's two. That's three. 4. 5. 6. Probably one more. Tooth's moving a little bit here, so there it is there. Look, it took about 7 strokes, right? Now, that was my point before about do's and don'ts, that if you are grinding on a grinder and you take that chain out in the field and you run the file through it, it won't match up. It might come close, but that one wasn't close because that grinding wheel that I used, that was to do Stills RS profile, which has a little bit different on the side plate compared to semi-chisel. So that's another do and don't. Now what we can do, that if we flip that around and we put the file in that, so we'll just put the file in that tooth, you'll find out that it matches up pretty good. Well, it's got to match up spot on really, because there it is there. And I'll come back up here, I'll clamp it here. Just got to make sure we're on the right tooth. There we are. And I may have to drop that tripod down a little bit so we can see now. Hopefully we can zoom right in there. And you can see now that the file's approximately 20 to 25% above. All right. And it's sitting in the groove really good at that point. All right. So that's what I mean about a do and a don't. That if you do grind on a grinder, that chain, don't use a file on it because the profile will be different. If you're the sort of person that is a hand filer, then it's not going to make any difference. If you're a person that uses a grinder a lot and you're out in the field, don't take one chain out. Anything can happen. The chain can jump off, they can damage the drive links and it doesn't fit back in the bar again. Always carry spare chains. This is a #1 rule. If you're going to cut for a couple of hours, 3 chains should get you out of trouble. So therefore, if you're a person that uses a chainsaw grinder and you've got 3 spare chains plus the one that's on the saw, that's a total of 4 chains. So you should be able to just swap them over. And if you do have to file it, bear in mind that that took about 7 strokes before it ended up with the shape of the file. So that's a waste of time. And that's one of the things that I always talk about, do's and don'ts, about using a file and using a grinder. To me, it's either one or the other. You either use files to sharpen your chainsaws or you use a chainsaw grinder. If you're doing both, that's the problem that you can run into, that you're going to have to spend a lot more time, 7 strokes a tooth. Whereas, had that have been filed by hand, you most likely would have only needed about 2 strokes, a very light stroke, just to refresh that edge and make it nice and sharp. But 7 meant that you're wasting time, 7 strokes per tooth. It's just you're wasting a lot of time sharpening a chain up that was ground on a grinder, and then you're going to run a file through it, unless you are excellent at profiling the grinding wheel. So I've got a list of 14 do's and don'ts. There's probably a few more. I'll just run over them just briefly. #1, do use the correct file. Don't use incorrect files. So make sure that the file diameter is suitable for your tooth. The other thing that you can do, if you've got a brand new tooth, let's say it's a 3/8, you can start off with a 5.5mm file and you can drop back to a 5.2. That's quite common. Also, a lot of manufacturers out there recommend 5.5mm files for their 3/8 chain. Still don't, they recommend 5.2. Okay. #2, don't press the grinder wheel. Don't dress. Do dress the grinder wheel to the correct radius of the file that you intend to use on the chain. So where possible, if you are going to take the chains out in the field, try and match the grinding wheel to the radius of the file as best as possible. And all you've got to do is do what I did here, put a bit of reg texture on there and try and get it within 2 or 3 strokes maximum. So I was 7 strokes out. That's too much. But that grinding wheel was used for RS. So that's number 2. And as I said, if you don't do it that way, you're going to find out that the radius that's on the file won't match up to the radius that's on the grinding wheel if you didn't do it properly. Number 3, do check the raker and adjust them occasionally. Make sure that probably after every couple of sharpies, at least check your rakers, right? Just put the gauge on and make sure. And the other thing, I don't want to get into that's a huge subject, between the constant flat gauge and a progressive depth gauge. So you're better off using a progressive depth gauge when you do your rakers. These type of flat little gauges like this, these are fairly common. They're okay when the chain's brand new, but as the chain wears down, they don't work 100% efficient. You're much better off with this type here, the progressive depth gauge. These are superior. These are from Still. So, yeah, do yourself a favour. They also sell them at Husqvarna. They also sell them over at West Coast Saws in America. Okay. The other thing that you need to do is every time that you use your chainsaw, make sure that you do tension the saw correctly. Don't have it so that it's loose, because you can find out quite easily that the chain can come off and it can whip around and it can cause serious damage, especially if you've got a long bar. The chain is more likely to come in contact with your hand and could do some damage. Okay, another do and don't. Make sure that you don't leave your air filter blocked up with rubbish. Do clean your air filter fairly regularly. Every time that you take the chain off or you come back home and from cutting, do a bit of maintenance. And I use a air hose, but if you don't have a air hose, probably the easiest thing to do is use a paintbrush and try and clean that air filter. You need to clean it somehow. Most of the concertina type air filters, the rib type ones, can be washed in soapy water, then left out in the sun to dry. So that's something to do. The other thing to do, and a lot of people don't do this, is check your spark plug probably after every 3 or 4 times that you've used your chainsaw for, long periods of time. It's not a bad idea just to pull it out, make sure it's that light tan color, it's not black, or it's not running too hot, and make sure, if you can remember, just run the feeler gauge through there and make sure it's okay. Probably if you're using the chainsaw fairly regularly, you might do it once a month, because in that once a month maintenance, I'll take off the clutch drum and I'll put grease on the roller bearings anyway. So that's part of general maintenance. Another thing, don't mix the fuel ratio incorrect. Normally it's 50-1. 45-1 is not too bad. So make sure that you do use the correct fuel ratio. Another one that we've got here is don't use the nose of the bar, as it can cause kickback. Very, very dangerous using the nose of the bar. Keep that nose, especially when you start to cut, keep that well away, especially if you put the top of the nose, the top half of the section of the nose, anywhere near timber, it's going to kick back and it could hit you and cause serious damage. Can't stress that enough. So that's definitely a don't. Don't use car oil for bar oil. A lot of people will drain, if they do oil changes on their car, they'll say, oh, look, I use car oil. Car oil doesn't cling to the metal as good, so it doesn't oil properly. So, yeah, a lot of people still do that. Also, don't use cheap 2-stroke oil. Chainsaws cost a lot of money. They rev extremely high RPM, around 13,000 RPM. You want probably synthetic oil at the least. Synthetic oil was developed for high-performance engines that revved excessively high for long periods of time. and that's exactly what a chainsaw does. It's a two-stroke engine. It revs up to 13,000 RPM, and it's at least revving 10,000 RPM while it's cutting through timber. So it stays at those elevated high RPMs for long periods of time. So you need really good oil. Don't go out and buy cheap two-stroke oil. The other thing is, if you're doing maintenance, and a lot of people don't do this, is that you should check your bar for uneven wear. And if you've got a raker file, it's as easy every now and then just to run the raker file over there, dress the top of the bar, run it over the sides to make sure you don't have any burrs. You can feel them with your finger. So that's something you want to check. The other thing is, you've got your high and your low settings. And where people can screw up on the high setting is that they turn it into far clockwise, and the saw will rev up too high, and this can cause the saw to overheat, run way too lean, and can cause piston damage, and you'll see scoring on the piston sometimes if you take the muffler off and you check. So on a lot of chainsaws, normally the high setting is anywhere from 1 to 1.5 turns open from closed position. It's pretty much on the low setting, it could be around the same, anywhere from 1.5 to 2 turns open, and that's roughly the setting. So don't play around and screw them up. That's why a lot of companies now put limiters on the chainsaw, those little plastic limiters, to stop people from screwing them up. So don't take them off. So that's another don't. Don't remove them unless you know what you're really doing, because people can screw their saws up, run them too lean, and wonder why things are not working properly. So that's pretty much it on the do's and don'ts. There's been quite a bit of information there. It's over a bit of a broad subject. I hope that information helps. It's mainly for the beginners, because anyone that's experienced with chainsaws really knows how to look after them, how to sharpen them, what to do. And if you do things incorrectly, or you got bad habits, you might find out that your saw doesn't cut properly. Another thing that I probably mention, it's another do and don't. A lot of people, you'll hear people say, my chainsaw cuts crooked. If you're using that flat, constant depth gauge, and your teeth are longer on one side than the other side, if you're using this particular gauge, you can find out that your chainsaw can cut crooked, because if the depth of the rakers is really different on one side than the other side, it will mean that one side is cutting more, which will want to pull to one side more than the other. However, if you use a progressive depth gauge, and that was invented by Ray Carlton back in the early 60s, it was called philo plate. The whole idea of a progressive depth gauge is the flat gauge sits over 3/4 teeth. The progressive depth gauge sits at an angle over one tooth. The raker protrudes through the window, and it sets the depth for how long the tooth is. So it's a ratio. The raker depth is set by the length of the tooth, whereas the little flat gauge sets 0.65 of a millimetre on every tooth, irrespective of whether the tooth is a little bit longer and shorter. So in other words, the progressive depth gauge will compensate whether you've got a shorter tooth or longer tooth. So I could file one side of the chain down halfway and using a progressive depth gauge, and it'll cut dead straight, because it's setting the depth for the wear of the tooth, whereas the other gauge just sets 0.65 of a millimetre irrespective of the wear of the tooth. So that's why it's called progressive, because it's progressive. What actually happens if you use a progressive depth gauge on a brand new chain, it'll be 0.65 of a millimetre approximately. By the time that you get down to the end of life, you'll find out that that gap won't be 0.65 of a millimetre, it'll be about 1.2 millimetres. On this chain here, because this is worn halfway down, you've probably got 0.9 of a millimetre raker depth. So yeah, progressive depth gauges is certainly something that you would do to sharpen your chains, and I don't like to use that flat gauge. It doesn't do a good enough job. Okay, some more do's and don'ts. Let's talk about bars and chains and what should you do and what shouldn't you do. Well, one of the things that you shouldn't do is put on larger bars unless you know what you're doing. And what I mean by that is, yes, a lot of chainsaws that are sold brand new can have larger bars fitted, especially if they're a powerful saw. MS660, it could come out with a 25-inch bar, but you could run a 36-inch bar on it. If you've got a smaller saw, what you can do is run a semi-skip chain, a full skip chain, and in the case of some of the larger big saws that want to put in 60, 70, 80-inch bars, they'll run hyper skip chains. So that's another do and don't. So if you've got a small saw, not much you can do about it. If it come out with a 16-inch bar and it's only got 35 cc's, the only change that you can do there is go backwards, 14-inch or 12-inch. Certainly not go upwards. So that's some do's and don'ts on bars and chains. The other do's and don'ts would be careful buying a floating rim sprocket kit for an MS170, because that'll go up in size, and if it goes up in size, you're going to get higher speed, but you don't have as much torque, because they don't have an 8-tooth sprocket on it. They've only got a 6-tooth sprocket, and if you jump up to a 7-tooth rim sprocket, then you're going to find out all you're going to do is get higher speed, but you won't have the torque to pull it, and it'll have more of a tendency to drop down. So that's some do's and don'ts there. I left the best one to last, do's and don'ts. Buying aftermarket stuff for your Stihl chainsaw or your Husqvarna. Now this is a really interesting one. So certainly if I've got a brand new chainsaw and something goes wrong, in most cases I'd always prefer to use a genuine part. In most cases. In the cases that it has happened to me, and I've had one particular saw, which was an MS380, and I bought that about 20 years ago, the first thing that played up on that was the coil. I brought a brand new coil, $170. I could have got an aftermarket one for $30. I wished that I would have. Another thing that I've brought aftermarket, carburetors. Wouldn't buy a brand new carburetor from Stihl. They cost too much money. They nearly cost as much as the half the price of the saw. So in that case, aftermarket. Done that quite a few times, never had a problem. Same as the coils. I have had a chainsaw that had a faulty coil, put an aftermarket one on for $30, not $170, $30, never had a problem. Floating rim sprockets, clutches, sprocket clutches, aftermarket, not a problem. Chainsaw files, aftermarket, not a problem. Even chains, aftermarket with no-name brands on it, or some brand you've never heard from coming out of China. Brought them, haven't had a problem. So there is a lot of aftermarket stuff like carburetors, files, coils, clutch drums, sprockets. The list goes on. Air filters, there's lots of aftermarket air filters with their special filters. There's so much aftermarket stuff out there, it's not funny. You can even virtually buy an aftermarket bottom end of the motor, or you can buy a complete motor, aftermarket motor. So there's so much aftermarket stuff out there. As I said, if I've got a very old chainsaw, the MS380, you go into a Stihl dealer and order parts from MS380. I don't even know whether you can get them now. Most likely you can't. So in that situation, I've got no choice. I brought an aftermarket piston and cylinder. That's quite common to do that. But as I said, if you start buying carburetors, coils, all this sort of stuff, for your old chainsaw, it's not worth it. It really isn't. You'd be better off buying a second-hand one for spare parts rather than buying individual parts, because a carburetor will cost you probably over $200 for a genuine steel carburetor, if not more. If you were to replace the entire chainsaw on spare parts, it'd probably cost you $10,000. And the motorbike industry is exactly the same. The prices are through the roof for spare parts. So yeah, aftermarket is definitely the way to go with the older chainsaws. Certain parts I will only buy genuine, and as the saw becomes almost redundant, then I'll buy aftermarket stuff because it's too hard to get it, and it's not worth spending hundreds of dollars on a saw that's 5 or 6 years old, or it's done a lot of work. It's seen a good life, a hard life. It's come to almost the end of its day. It's almost ready for the scrap heap, but I can bring some more life back into that saw by buying aftermarket parts without breaking the bank account. So look, I hope all these little do's and don'ts may help. Certainly if you're a new user into chainsaw, a lot of those do's and don'ts will help. If you're an experienced user, you should know all those do's and don'ts. There's probably a handful or a lot more of do's and don'ts that I haven't mentioned, but we're pushing well over 45 minutes into this video, and I think I've mentioned enough do's and don'ts for the time being. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, and if you've got some do's and don'ts, put them down in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.